everyone. Thanks for joining us today. I'm Dee Dee Laugesen, Executive Secretary for the Committee on the Present Danger China. We appreciate your interest in our weekly webinars, in which we expose and analyze the Chinese Communist Party's unrestricted warfare against America and the help being provided to the CCP in waging that warfare by captured U.S. elites. We encourage you to visit presentdangerchina.org for information on new programs, access to videos of our past webinars, and tons of other very valuable information. Our moderator today is Frank Gaffney. Frank is the Executive Chairman for the Center for Security Policy, Vice Chair for the Committee on the Present Danger China, and host of Securing America with Frank Gaffney on Real America's Voice Network.
Welcome, everyone, to this edition of our webinar series sponsored by the Committee on the Present Danger China. It focuses on the Chinese Communist Party's unrestricted warfare against our nation and its efforts more generally to take down the free world with the help of, among others, American elites. We're going to be focusing today on a very strategic part of the world, a theater of operations for this Chinese Communist Party, well, unrestricted warfare of the pre-kinetic kind, but quite possibly imminently of the shooting war variety as well. We're going to be discussing what I call Xi Jinping's frog boiling of his new Cold War. That's, of course, a reference to the old adage that if you want to boil a frog in a pot of water, turn up the heat slowly. And that has been taking place now for some time in the Western Pacific. Particularly, we'll be focusing, I think, considerably on the southern reaches of the Western Pacific, as they have inexorably been seeking to extend their influence, their military presence, their power projection capabilities, and not least, their ability to achieve the kind of dominance, both in that area, they've considered it part of their waters, for that matter, and far beyond, of course, as well. We're going to discuss this from the perspective of several eminent figures, people we have had the privilege of working with on these programs in the past and who bring some extraordinarily important insights into developments that have been taking place throughout these waters and the islands that dot them, and that have, I think, a very keen understanding of how those developments can translate into real hostilities between not just some of those nations in the region and the Chinese Communist Party, but ourselves as well. To begin, we're going to talk with a very accomplished veteran of, well, these programs, but also of the United States Marine Corps, Colonel Grant Newsom. Now retired, he has been, in addition to a warrior, a foreign service officer, and an executive in international businesses operating in the Western Pacific. He is the author of an important new book, When China Attacks, a Warning to America. We're always delighted to have him with us, and especially to sort of set the stage for this conversation by discussing some of these developments, but also the extraordinary efforts that the Chinese are now making to achieve a dominant position to the rear of our front lines of defense against their aggression, and the extent to which simply upping our game is no longer sufficient. Colonel, it's great to have you back.
Well, thanks very much, Frank. I'll get started right away. What are the Chinese objectives? I'll put it simply, it's to get the Americans out of the Pacific and to take it over, to dominate it. And this isn't anything new, not for the the Chinese nor for some other people. Now, this is a slide. If you just step back a bit and catch your breath and look at it. And what it is it's a depiction of where the main battles in the Pacific were fought in World War II. And if you notice the red line out to the east, it's a circle. It goes out to the east and then swings around. That was the full extent of Japanese domination, Japanese control. And the Chinese want the Pacific for the same reasons that the Japanese did. So one, they could have everything in it, decide what goes on there, but also to keep the Americans out. And it's the same basic objectives the Japanese had. It's ironic that the Chinese are now acting like the Japanese of the 1930s. And to give you one just anecdote of how the Chinese think, it was in the 2000s, late 2000s, a Chinese official, who's a military guy, he spoke with the commander of the U.S. Pacific Command, all the U.S. forces in the Pacific, and he said, well, how about if we take west of Hawaii and you can have east of Hawaii? And the Chinese always telegraph their punches. They tell you exactly what they think. And we may think, well, that was just, he was joking, or it was just an outrageous statement. It will never happen. But no, that is the Chinese objective. And what you find now is the Chinese have got a presence in every Pacific island. You'd be hard-pressed to find one of any consequence where there isn't a Chinese presence. And you may say, well, look, the Chinese haven't sent their military out there very much, just a few ships here and there. They've invited some locals for training, but they haven't really got a presence. Well, that's coming, and you'll hear some more about this later on. But the thing to watch for when we talk about the Chinese presence in the Pacific Islands, and it's a predictable sequence that it plays out everywhere. The specifics might vary, but not so much the basics. And it all starts with a commercial presence. Okay, but it starts with a commercial presence, and you get Chinese people on the ground, some of them businessmen, some of them ostensibly businessmen, and they get their claws into the place in a business sense. You find that they take over the local shops, the main industries, which in the Pacific Islands are the fishing, the timber industries, and these come under Chinese domination. And this leads to political influence, where you create a constituency that sees their interests, financial interests principally, and often their power, depends on the Chinese. It's based on that. And thus you've just divided your society. But there's now you now have a pro-China constituency. And the next step, and it hasn't played out so much yet, except for it's just starting to, and you'll hear more later, is there's a military component to this. You'll find, for example, that where the Chinese businessmen are picking up ports and airfields, that they're actually very good for future naval and military uses as well. But as I say, it is a sequence that plays out everywhere, and that's always the thing to watch for there. But there's also something else now when we're setting the stage here, is that while we're talking about the Pacific here, and you may ask, well, what are the Americans doing? And I would say not very much, unfortunately. They've taken the Pacific for granted. So what we're doing now is we're focusing extensively on the left edge, the left side of the Pacific. And you've heard about the first island chain. If you look on the left, you'll see Japan, and then it goes down to Taiwan, then to the Philippines, and then it goes down to Malaysia. And that is effectively a barrier to the Chinese military getting easy access to the Pacific. And that's where the Americans are focusing. And we have doing pretty well with Japan now. Philippines, things have shifted in our direction. Taiwan, we're sort of talking about defending them, but that is where we're principally focused. And think of it as being on a castle wall. You're defending against, say, the Mongolians coming, and you're in pretty good shape, or you're at least in decent enough shape, and you have the terrain in your favor. And then suppose the bad guys show up in your rear, and those are the islands in the Pacific. So while we're focused on the first island chain and looking west, the Chinese have set up over the last 30 years, it actually goes back a bit farther, but at least just take the last 30 years and have set up in just about every one of these Pacific islands. And as I said, they are laying down the political infrastructure, the military, and eventually the military infrastructure. They're actually, and if you, just one example, they are, and you'll hear some others, but there's an island place called Kiribati, which is sort of off to the right there on the map. And that is where the Battle of Tarawa was fought in World War II. The Chinese are now redoing an old American airfield there to make it usable for everything. And it's about, 1,500 miles from Pearl Harbor. And so that is just one example of the Chinese telegraphing their punches, showing what they're doing. But the point is that they've gotten into our rear. And that is why this is also important here. Because you could do everything right on the first island chain. You could even lock up the South China Sea so nobody can get out of it. And then the other guys are already behind you, particularly as they have used the political influence to get sort of pro-Chinese governments in place that will welcome in the PLA, welcome in the Chinese military. And I would just note for thoroughness that the Chinese are not content with west of Hawaii. They have set up the commercial and the military infrastructure in Latin America. Most of the countries in Latin America have shifted towards China now. And the Chinese do see the future as one where the PLA is operating throughout the entire Pacific, and the Americans are either pushed out or on the back foot, to put it mildly. So the geography and say looking at a map will give you some a good sense of things. Well, what are the Americans? Certainly the American military knows all about this, and they've gotten ready for it. We'll know for a long time until maybe just a few years ago. The middle of the Pacific was not of interest to the American military. They had at most a token presence, and it was a periodic presence, nothing to crow about. They realize now that they've made a mistake with that, and they're trying to sort of do more now, but they have not done what is necessary. So the military, they didn't do what they needed to do. And the Chinese could certainly see that our lack of presence was a lack of interest. The State Department, well, most of the countries in the Pacific don't have a U.S. embassy. And if you're not there, you're not interested, and the locals can pick up on that as well. Additionally, in the south part of the Pacific, we outsource that to the Australians and to the New Zealanders to a degree, but I'll just pick on the Australians. They're probably the best ally we have, but their performance down in the southern Pacific deserves a failing grade. Outsourcing to the Australians was a colossal mistake of strategic importance. You don't see a whole lot of American business rushing to get into the Pacific either, into these places. That's why there's not enough money to be made. The return on investment isn't enough. So we sort of don't have that presence the way we should. There is some American commercial activity, but not much. But all in all, it's an area where the phrase benign neglect was actually coined to refer to the American treatment of the Pacific Islands. We took them for granted, assumed that, well, they love us, so they'll always be on our side. But that was probably a mistake. And finally, we're now sort of waking up, but there's an awfully long way to go. So just a summary of things to try to set the stage. And when you do think of the Pacific, look at that map, look at the middle of it, and then consider that we are focusing our efforts on the left side, on that first island chain, while the Chinese are setting up with the sequence of commercial, political, and eventually it will be military presence. And I would note that it's all greased. What the Chinese do is all of it, everywhere, is greased by under-the-table payments, bribes, emoluments, trips to China for officials to have some hospitality. You can figure out what that means. Also, doing things like building sort of houses for the government officials and renting their houses out, etc. But there's just immense bribes and seedy activity going on, and it largely goes unmentioned, unaddressed. And if you can play by those rules, you can see a huge advantage you've got. And I would note also the Chinese are encouraging secessionist movements in certain parts of the Pacific, New Caledonia, Micronesia, naming a couple. So this is the scenario that we're faced with. that we've, through our own neglect, we have got to catch up very quickly. Otherwise, we will find ourselves sort of pushed back east of Hawaii if we're lucky. So thanks a lot.
Colonel, thank you so much. I want to thank one of our upcoming speakers, Cleo Pascal, for providing that very important graphic and you working through it as well as you did, sir. The history of this part of the world is one that is soaked in, among others, American blood. And our benign neglect, or one might even add malign neglect, is the more scandalous for really betraying that incredible investment that has been made by American fighting men in World War II, most especially. Those fights were about liberating these islands from Japanese tyranny. We now find ourselves watching new battles shaping up, so far of the pre-violent kind. And I think, Colonel Newsom, as usual, you very nicely described the kind of fight that is underway at the moment, the unrestricted warfare kind, and the extent to which it is making real headway in the absence of American attention and engagement at every level. I think I would only add that, as is often observed, nature abhors a vacuum, so do geopolitics. But unfortunately, that same neglect has applied to that other part of the Pacific that, as you pointed out, is now very much in the crosshairs of the Chinese Communist Party as well, namely Latin America. And we'll be talking more about that in the course of this program. But Colonel, again, thank you for setting the stage very handsomely for the conversation to follow. We're going to turn next to Chris Chappell, Chris Chappell, the star of an absolutely superb YouTube channel program. It's entitled China Uncensored. It combines a marvelous, melange of humor, satire, and fact that is, I think, particularly powerful as a vehicle for explaining to the rest of us what is going on with the Chinese Communist Party, its agenda, and the dangers that it represents for all of us. He is to be found at the at China Uncensored on Twitter, among other social media platforms. Chris has recently been engaged in what I'm thinking is appropriately called the Battle of Guadalcanal 2.0. We're going to hear a little bit of the backstory of his involvement in trying to help the forces of freedom prevail there, rather than those being seduced, enlisted, and otherwise suborned by the Chinese Communist Party. Chris, it's great to have you with us once again. Over to you, sir.
Thank you very much, Frank. And thank you, Colonel Newsom, for giving a really good overview of the situation in the Pacific. I think what I'd like to do is kind of zoom in on Solomon Islands. It's sort of a microcosm of everything the Chinese Communist Party is doing in the region. And, I'll begin with some good news. There's recently been a lot of talk and concern that China is trying to replace the US dollar with its own currency. But I'm happy to say that with the amount of bribes China is making in Solomon Islands using US dollars, they have no intention of getting rid of the US dollars. It's very, very important to the Chinese Communist Party. So Solomon Islands, it's the home of a very major battle in World War II, the Battle of Guadalcanal. In a very real way, American blood is soaked into the soil of Solomon Islands. Bizarrely, though, over the years, the U.S. has withdrawn its presence in the region, choosing to instead relegate it to the auspices of Australia and New Zealand, which have done a dismal job of managing the region. What is happening in Solomon Islands is they have come in with the promise of development, infrastructure, and a heavy dose of bribes to get the government there on its side, particularly the Prime Minister, Masato Sogavari. A few years ago, Solomon Islands went from recognizing Taiwan to switching its allegiance to China, to the People's Republic of China. And what I want to focus on is a man named Daniel Soidani. He was the premier of the Malaita province. That's the most populous province of Solomon Islands. He, particularly because, as he said, of his Christian values and because the Chinese Communist Party is officially atheist, he has been standing up to Prime Minister Sogavari, standing up to the Chinese Communist Party, trying to banish CCP influence in the region. He was responsible for blocking Huawei, the Chinese telecom company, from building in his province. He has again and again stood up for Taiwan, saying that the Solomon Islands should not be recognizing People's Republic of China. He has become an incredible thorn in the side of Beijing and Prime Minister Sogavari in just essentially walking over the region. And they have fought back hard against Mr. Soidani. A few years ago, he needed life-saving medical treatment, and the government essentially prevented him from getting that. The only reason he's alive today is because President Tsai Ing-wen of Taiwan got him to Taiwan to get the medical treatment he needed. We interviewed Mr. Soidani then. It was a major story. Really, it shows that the Chinese Communist Party is willing to essentially kill critics and dissidents in other countries, even in supposedly democratic countries. We interviewed him then, and sadly, there's been very little press coverage over Mr. Soidani and what's happening in the Solomon Islands. And the result of this growing influence in Solomon Islands is that they have signed a secret security pact that could very well see a Chinese military base in Solomon Islands. Again, this was a major staging point for Japan during World War II. This has massive national security ramifications for the United States. More recently, Sogavari has, as these kind of people tend to do, postponed elections. His excuse was that the Solomon Islands is going to be hosting the Pacific Games, sort of like a regional Olympics. And he said the country only had money for either elections or the Pacific Games. So he chose the Games. And as an example of how Australia has really botched things, they offered, they said, oh, you're having some shortages with money. Well, we'll provide some money to help with the Games. Not the elections, the game. Police forces in Solomon Islands are being trained by the Chinese Communist Party now. Australia has sent shipments of assault weapons to what's becoming essentially Beijing stormtroopers in the islands. And the way we have been involved recently is Mr. Soidani, since they weren't able to silence him with the medical treatment, they were able to spread bribes around and essentially get him kicked out of his position as premier of Malaita province. It took 3 votes of no confidence, but by the 3rd one, they finally were able to get enough votes to kick him out. Propagandists working for Sogavari have painted a picture of Soidani as working with the Taiwanese and the U.S. government to assassinate Prime Minister Sogavari. These are very vicious lies that ultimately make it clear that they want Soidani to disappear. They want him to either be quiet or he will be nabbed up by Solomon Islands security forces at some point or another. So this is where China Uncensored came in. Mr. Soidani was traveling to New York to speak at the UN about climate change in the region as an indigenous person. So we at China Uncensored started a GoFundMe campaign to raise funds to bring Mr. Soidani and his advisors, Celsus Talihu, to Washington, D.C. to speak to the U.S. government and warn politicians about what China is doing. Because if the Chinese Communist Party is successful in Solomon Islands, if they are able to silence Sweidani, that means the whole region is basically theirs. No one will stand up against the Chinese Communist Party if they're able to silence Sweidani, and there is no U.S. pushback. Unfortunately, the Biden State Department, led by Secretary of State Blinken, denied his visa to come to the U.S. Very vague, non-committal reasons. Fortunately, bipartisan congressional letters essentially demanded that he should get his visa, and he did get his visa. But then on top of that, another challenge that came up is, as I said, we started a GoFundMe campaign to raise the funds to bring him to DC. And, you know, the fans of my show are very, very passionate about human rights and freedom and standing up to the Chinese Communist Party. In just under 24 hours, we were able to raise $27,000 to cover his trip, as well as provide some of the legal funds he needs to challenge what's been happening to him in the Solomon Islands. Unfortunately, GoFundMe froze those funds. They wouldn't give it to us, so we had to front a lot of the money for the trip. But fortunately, we got him to DC, and we were able to tell GoFundMe, look, we're talking to the U.S. media. I was about to testify before a congressional briefing about the situation and GoFundMe freezing the funds, and just coincidentally, before the congressional briefing, they decided to release the funds. So that was a nice development. And I think this is very important because it shows that even when we have big tech companies and high-level politicians in the Biden administration or any part of the U.S. government, you know, the people are able to make a difference. There are Congress people who are making the difference, who are standing up to the Chinese Communist Party. And so we had a very successful trip with Mr. Sweidani in D.C. He spoke to many representatives, Congress people. He gave a wonderful speech at the National Press Club. He spoke at a fabulous event at the Heritage Foundation. And all this is what this is doing is it's raising his profile, making him stick out like a sore thumb, so that when he returns to the Solomon Islands, Prime Minister Sogavari and the Chinese Communist Party will have a very hard time of just making him disappear. And with any luck, this will raise enough awareness of what is happening in Solomon Islands that Sogavari essentially becomes radioactive to Beijing, that they know they can no longer use him for their purposes. So, as you said, this is the Battle of Guadalcanal 2.0. If we're able to defeat the Chinese Communist Party here, then we have a good chance of pushing them back in the rest of the Pacific. Unfortunately, if the United States does not do what it needs to defend people like Daniel Sweidani, we're going to have a very difficult uphill battle. Unfortunately, I did just hear that President Biden is supposedly making his way to Papua New Guinea, and he might be stopping by Solomon Islands, which unfortunately would be a big boost to Sogavari, unless Biden is very adamant about calling him out for his ties to Beijing. So it's the battle is still undecided, but again, I'm very assured by what I saw the fans of China Uncensored do for Mr. Sweidani, what people in Congress are doing for him, and the people like you, Frank, and everyone watching who want to become aware of what's happening and will not be silent about the Chinese Communist Party, essentially following the playbook of Imperial Japan in World War II. So, thank you.
Chris, thank you. A very heartening story about, as you say, people making a difference. And under your leadership in particular, China Uncensored has become a great vehicle for fostering action. And I salute you for it. And I'm so appreciative of you being able to join us to talk a bit about a success up to a point, at least, in helping Minister Sweidani make his way into Washington and hopefully make his case here as well. We're going to turn next to another frequent contributor to this series. Brad Thayer is his name. Dr. Thayer is colleague of ours at the Center for Security Policy, where he runs our China programs. He is a prolific contributor to the public policy debate through various op-eds and columns and articles in the periodic press. He is also the author of a really important new book, a co-author with Lian Xiaohan, of Understanding the China Threat. He has a new piece that has just come out at the Washington Times, co-authored with another of our favorites here, Captain James Fennell, United States Navy retired, another member of our Committee on the Present Danger of China, that concerns a, well, important, some would say radical idea for enhancing deterrence of China in light of the threats that it poses, most obviously and immediately to Taiwan, but almost certainly to others east and probably west of Hawaii. Bradley Thayer was able to join us by videotape, and we're very pleased to have him with us. We'll turn to him now.
Thank you, Frank, very much for that warm introduction. What we've witnessed and that my colleagues have addressed expertly is really to look at the impact of CCP's, the Chinese Communist Party's expansion in the Pacific region. And that includes really leapfrogging over the first island chain and moving into and pressuring the second as well. So what I'd like to do today is really address two major topics. Rather than looking at what China is doing, my colleagues have addressed, I'd really like to focus on the importance of Taiwan and what the United States should do to ensure that China doesn't get past the first island chain. It's a very important topic. And then secondly, measures that the U.S. can take. So first, what we're witnessing is China's universal expansion. It's a global expansion in Africa. It's in South and Central America, in Europe, and of course in the Indo-Pacific region, Central Asia. From the Arctic to the Antarctic, we're witnessing China's expansion. And the Pacific and the microstates and states on the periphery are no exception to this. Taiwan is instrumental in stopping the expansion of the Chinese Communist Party to ensure that it does not become a global expansion, but in fact, that China is effectively contained, and at least in the naval aspect in this region. So the first island chain coming through Japan to Taiwan to the Philippines is a natural space to stop Chinese expansion. And Taiwan here is absolutely of the greatest significance for the following reasons. First, it is for economic reasons, and that is that not only is Taiwan a thriving economy, but it comprises the major chip manufacturers in the world upon which the global economy depends. So for economic reasons, Taiwan is of the utmost importance to the United States and the U.S. economy. Secondly, and this deserves to be stressed, Taiwan occupies critical geopolitical space, being approximately 110 miles off of the Chinese coast. It serves as a natural cork in the bottle for the stopping the expansion of the Chinese Navy and Chinese military influence into in the Pacific as well as elsewhere. Taiwan serves as an unsinkable aircraft carrier, as Great Britain was once described during World War II, to project power against China and against Chinese assets on the coast as well as inland, as well as in the seas surrounding Taiwan. It offers also a very important intelligence base for the United States. Third reason is political, and that is Taiwan is a thriving democracy, and it demonstrates what China might have been if the CCP had not come to power. So Taiwan's existence is an existential threat to the Chinese Communist Party. So for all of these reasons, Taiwan is a very important actor and a key partner for the United States. To address the prodigious threat to Taiwan, the United States must take the following actions. First, it needs to work with its allies, Japan, increasingly the Philippines, thankfully, and Australia, to provide a conventional deterrent so that Taiwan would be able to meet Chinese attack, which is certain to come, as Air Force General Mike Minahan has predicted in 2025. James Fennell, a retired U.S. Navy Captain James Fennell, and I anticipate in our writings that it will come even sooner than that. So in the very near term, a conventional deterrent has to be created for Taiwan. That's going to take years to develop, as the United States, its allies, and Taiwan are going to have to work together to ensure that Taiwan has the conventional capabilities to meet a deterrent, to provide a robust deterrent. In the meantime, the United States, James Fennell and I argue, should work to bolster its extended deterrent capabilities to Taiwan, including the transfer of tactical nuclear weapons, B-61 airdropped nuclear bombs that are stationed in Europe. Some number of them should be moved to the region, including being based on Taiwan itself, as well as in neighboring states. These are air-delivered weapons that provide the connecting tissue between conventional weapons and additional nuclear capabilities up the escalation ladder. That would be strategic nuclear capabilities that the United States may be called upon to deter an attack by China against Taiwan. So tactical nuclear weapons are weapons that we have today. They're present in Europe, and they should be redeployed to the Indo-Pacific region to augment a modest nuclear capability. We see, given China's prodigious conventional growth, the growth of its conventional military as well as nuclear capabilities, that it serves as a major threat to all of the United States' extended deterrent commitments. That would be Japan and Australia and the Philippines now, as a result of agreements that are being reached by Ferdinand Marcos Jr. and President Biden. That umbrella is being tested by the growth of Chinese capabilities, and that also introduces some significant proliferation pressures on Japan to acquire its own nuclear capabilities, as well as South Korea and Taiwan itself. A logical solution would be for Taiwan to develop its own nuclear capabilities in years to come. But the proliferation process is a long one and fraught with risks. And so to meet the immediate need, a tactical nuclear capability based in theater offers a very significant deterrent today to Chinese military power. And that indeed is necessary, again, because of the growth of China's capabilities and the intent, as voiced by the Communist Party's leader, Xi Jinping, to conquer Taiwan and to force it into direct control by the Chinese Communist Party. In addition to tactical nuclear capabilities, the United States should work assiduously to develop sea-launched cruise missile nuclear, the SLICM-N capability, which is not advancing as rapidly as it should, to ensure that there are additional capabilities above the tactical level, at the theater level, to ensure that all rungs on the nuclear ladder of escalation are going to be met, thus providing China with no incentive to escalate. And only then will U.S. capabilities be significant and robust enough to ensure that there is a strong deterrent to ensure that the cork of Taiwan essentially stays in the bottle and keeps China contained in the first island chain, which is absolutely necessary at this stage to do. So in conclusion, if we reflect on the steps that Taiwan is taking and the Biden administration is taking, there are some conventional capabilities that are flowing to Taiwan. They're inadequate and are likely to remain so for years to come because of supply chain issues that the United States has. The United States is not spun up as it needs to be for high-intensity warfare, and it needs to ensure that it is able to generate the conventional capabilities necessary and logistical support for forces in the region, including our allied forces, and Taiwan to ensure that there is a conventional deterrent. And in the meantime, tactical nuclear capabilities deployed to the region offers a modicum of deterrence in the immediate term, which is so necessary. Taiwan is sine qua non to any defense and offers really the central front for the United States in its efforts to deter China's expansion and China's threat against its allies, South Korea, Japan, the Philippines, Australia, as well as key partners like Taiwan and India. And indeed, to ensure that the Chinese Communist Party's threat to the homeland of the United States is dealt with through adequate steps. Thank you very much indeed for your attention.
Dr. Bradley Thayer, thank you for your very important contribution, as always, and for putting into play in this conversation the necessity of having more deterrent capability than we presently do, relying almost entirely on the conventional forces of the United States in the Pacific and scattered elsewhere around the world. We're going to talk more about that and other possible ways of achieving deterrence in our question and answer. But before we do that, we're going to have, as I mentioned earlier, a final very important presentation from a woman who has really distinguished herself as one of America's preeminent experts on this particular part of the world, its strategic importance, the degree to which, as Colonel Newsom indicated, we have treated it with benign, if not actually malign, neglect, and the urgent need to reverse course before we have lost not perhaps just the first island chain, but the second one in the south and other parts of the Western Pacific. Her name is Cleo Pascal. She is a non-resident fellow of the Foundation for Defense of Democracies and has been very actively involved here and in the United Kingdom in making the case for upping our game, yes, but also decisively countering the Chinese Communist Party's increasing aggression, whether of the frog-boiling kind or perhaps the full-on military sort, may well, as we've heard, be in the offing. Cleo Pascal, thank you so much for adjusting your schedule to join us. We're delighted to have you with us, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. It's great to be with you, and a real honor and privilege to be sharing the panel with these three experts, and having them do all the work setting everything up is particularly great. Makes it a lot easier. Colonel Newsom gave kind of the overview of the region, and Chris Chappell's described a little bit about the Solomon stuff, and I have to say, China Uncensored has brought a whole new set of levers to the fight that have been essential and very interesting to watch. So I'd like to thank China Uncensored for that also. And of course, Dr. Thayer talking about the importance of Taiwan. If the map is available, I'd like to put it up to explain a little bit about how Taiwan ties directly into the Pacific Islands. Because we do talk a lot about the first and second island chain. Thank you very much. But there is another chain that the U.S. has been counting on almost without really naming it or realizing it. And it's this sort of freedom trail, this bridge of countries and parts of the U.S. that allow the U.S. to operate from Hawaii all the way to the coast of the Philippines, and in fact, just right off of Taiwan. Colonel Newsom mentioned the goal of China's goal to push the U.S. back to Hawaii. In order to do that, they really need to control or influence specifically in these three countries, in Palau, the Federated States of Micronesia, and the Marshall Islands. They abut on the western side the Commonwealth of Northern Marianas and Guam, which are the U.S., which is U.S. territory. So they are kind of the freedom meat in the middle of the sandwich that goes between Hawaii and Guam, Marianas, but functionally all the way to Taiwan. We've taken this bridge, this operational bridge, for granted. And just to give you a sense of how important these three countries are to the United States, they're independent countries, completely independent countries, but they've signed compacts of free association, which is why they're sometimes known collectively as the freely associated states, with the United States. They're freely associated with the United States. So what that means in terms of this agreement is they've given the U.S. defense and security oversight of their independent countries, including rights of strategic denial. That means that the U.S. can operate militarily all the way through that zone. And that zone it's hard to get a sense of scale, but it's as large as the continental United States. So the U.S. has this enormous chunk of ocean backing up to the Philippines, almost coming up to Taiwan, abutting Guam and Marianas, thanks to these three countries deciding voluntarily to align themselves with the United States. Of those three countries, two of them recognize Taiwan. That's Palau and the Marshall Islands, the ones on the edges, the one on the left and the one on the right. The one in the middle, the Federated States of Micronesia, which is very large, recognizes China. But the president of Micronesia, current president, David Penuelo, he lost a recent election, so he will be out of office on May 11th, has written a letter, 13-page letter. The first 11 pages or so describe how Chinese political warfare operations in his country have effectively started to turn it into a proxy state. He describes incidences, just as one kind of very clear example, with Sinovac, where the U.S. provided vaccines to Micronesia, and they didn't. Who wanted to take them took them. Some did, some didn't. But China really wanted to push Sinovac into FSM. And he, as president, said, no, we don't want it. We've got what we need if we're going to use them. And China bypassed the president, and suddenly he found his own ministry saying, okay, first of all, Chinese citizens in FSM can use Sinovac. And then suddenly his whole country was, according to the ministers, accepting Sinovac. They completely bypassed normal bilateral relations on something like that. It's just a small example, but it's indicative of how in an independent country, there's a bypassing of inconvenience governance for Beijing. And what that does is it creates a contention within the government. It means those ministers and the president are fighting each other, which further weakens the state, which makes it even easier for Chinese political warfare operations to be effective. So his first 11 pages are just as describing that dynamic, and he describes it very clearly in the context of China needing to do that in order to be in a position to take Taiwan. Because once they take Taiwan, Taiwan is not the end point. Taiwan is the launch point. And if Taiwan is the launch point, then the next zone that China needs to dominate is those Pacific Islands, especially if, as Colonel Newsham said, the goal is to get the U.S. out of the Pacific and push it back to Hawaii. So he described very clearly how that looks like on the ground. And then in the last couple of pages, he says, and this letter came out March 9th, I would like to de-recognize China and instead recognize Taiwan. And he describes talking to Wu in Taiwan and what would be needed for that to happen. So we hear about a loss with Honduras, for example, but we haven't, for whatever reason, the fact that there is a leader of a country that stuck his neck out to say, I want to flip to Taiwan, hasn't been widely reported, and he has not been supported either. From what I hear, State Department is not behind this. And Taiwan can't do it without the U.S. In this context, they think it's State Department approval. So you could have had a situation where you had this bridge of freedom, three countries in a row that recognize Taiwan, in between Hawaii and Guam, up to Taiwan, the Philippines, which have a deep defense and security relationship with the United States. But it didn't happen. And it didn't happen not because the local leadership didn't want it to happen, but because they're not getting the sort of backing from the United States that they need to make it happen. The two countries on either side, the ones that currently recognize Taiwan, Palau and Marshall Islands, are under extreme PRC political warfare assault to try to get them to abandon Taiwan. And both of those countries, Palau and Marshall Islands, have elections coming up within the next year or so. And there's an enormous amount of Chinese money going into anti-US candidates, however you want to frame it. That's functionally what it is. It's candidates who would support the PRC regime. So you have a potential of having, instead of this bridge of freedom, which US defense architecture has taken for granted since the end of World War II, you have the potential to have 3 Solomon Islands in a row between Hawaii and Guam. And we're potentially only about a year away from that really happening and becoming embedded into China's architecture for the region. Yeah, so it would be, if you're looking at the map, again, look at the size of Palau, Federated States of Micronesia, and Marshall Islands. And these are places where the relationship with the U.S. came from shared fighting for liberation the last time around. Palau is the site of the Battle of Peleliu. Federated States of Micronesia is Truk. Marshall Islands, voluntarily many Marshallese abandoned their homes so that nuclear testing could be done for what they thought was the sake of global security. The nuclear issue is a whole other thing, but they were made voluntary sacrifices for the sake of U.S. security. That whole bridge is now in danger. The management from the U.S. side of those relationships has been, as was said, benign neglect, but also haphazard. Those compacts of free association are an agreement that is supposed to last another 20 years or so, may be renewed, may not. But the current phase right now is a renegotiation of the financial component, which gets renegotiated every 20 years. And you'll hear announcements probably within the next couple of weeks that 2 of the countries have signed their agreements, and Marshall Islands hasn't. So Palau and FSM likely will sign within the next couple of weeks. But that doesn't mean that they will be approved in Congress, those agreements. And it doesn't necessarily mean, in the case of Marshall Islands specifically, that it'll be approved in the Marshall Islands. And the linking of the financial aspect of the compacts to the U.S. defense and security access to that large strategic area means that if the U.S. takes that approach, that means that the Chinese can then say, well, we'll give you that and $1 more. And when the war with Taiwan comes, we won't bomb you. Because the other thing is that as the U.S. puts in critical installations or existing ones like Kwajalein in Marshall Islands, or there's a over-the-horizon radar installation going in Palau, the people in those locations who have memories of what happened during World War II know that that makes them a Chinese target. They know the over-the-horizon radar installation and Kwajalein the people who live there assume they will have missiles coming at them and they may die 3 minutes before the Taiwanese do. So understanding the importance of that zone, which is currently a bridge of freedom, but we don't know how long it'll last, and what needs to be done to secure it, is essential for understanding how to protect Taiwan and how to ensure the Western security architecture that we've taken for granted in the Western Pacific isn't compromised by effective Chinese political warfare.
Leo, thank you so much. This is really perfect rounding out, I think, of the treatment that we've given to a part of the world that you understand well, and the rest of us need to be very seriously seized with at the moment. And again, folks, we're not talking about this as an abstraction. We're talking about what is part of the not so distant past, when Americans fought and died to liberate this region as part of its, unconditional approach to victory over the Japanese Empire. We are facing a danger that is, I would argue, vastly greater than that empire was in its heyday. And we need to understand it as such and address it properly as well. Colonel Newsom, we have had several suggestions made about what we need to be doing now. I'd like to get your thoughts as well on that subject, sir.
It's pretty easy to describe the problems we have in the Pacific and how we got there, etc. And it's all true, and there's no excuse for it other than there's a lot of people to blame. But now, what do you do about it? Well, I'll just run through a few ideas. And I was laying into the U.S. military, saying that they hadn't really done much till the last few years, and I don't take that back. But they are sort of waking up, and you're seeing more of a U.S. presence more often in more places in the Pacific, in these islands. And one idea that I've always proposed is having small detachments of U.S. forces, Marines, whomever, in these places, and led by one of these good young captains, or maybe a really young major, who like being out on the edge of empire, using their initiative, have that presence. And you'd be surprised what good it can do. And it doesn't have to be big. And it wouldn't take much, either financially or in terms of manpower, but it's that presence. If you're not there, you're not interested. And when you are there, it is amazing how Americans are received. Also, I would caution in all of our military activities in the Pacific Islands is to avoid the Harlem Globetrotters syndrome, which is to send a force down to do an exercise and flex their muscles and show how wonderful they are and then go away. And it doesn't do any good, really. But you have to have a more permanent presence. But pay attention to that Harlem Globetrotters business. And also, don't think that sending down a 3- or 4-star admiral or general to have tea with some local official is going to make that much of a difference. The Chinese will say, yeah, he came, and you'll notice he got on his airplane and left right away. We're here all the time. We can do things for you. So the military, though, is finally waking up. It's looking at the whole map, and it does have to take advantage of opportunities that it's given. In the last decade, I can think of at least 4 places where the Americans were offered bases or access to the point it amounted to bases. They're basically said, please come, turned it down. You've got to stop doing that. But as I noted earlier, you can get the military part right, you still might lose because you haven't handled the rest of the political warfare business right, the political, the commercial, the diplomatic, or even the propaganda. And that's where you have to look at the U.S. State Department, ask, well, what are they doing? Do they have people lined up waiting to be posted to Vienna, or are they lined up trying to get a posting to the Pacific, assuming there's even an embassy in these places? And I think we know the answer to that. You have got to make it a priority where the people on the make who want to, the good young officers or even older officers who want to do something important, they want to get to the Pacific. Unless they do, that the Chinese will have us on the back foot all the time. They are building some embassies. The U.S. is building some embassies in more places now. Solomon Islands, for example, because they sort of got the wits scared out of them. But what's that going to amount to? Is it just a few of the second string out there taking notes of what's happening? No, you want people there who are going to represent the United States and use its influence to support the people who don't want Chinese domination, who want honest government. In terms of U.S. business in the region, well, that's a tough one. But the Japanese know how to operate there. They are operating there. The Indians have potential, Taiwan too. America should get together with these places and with these countries and figure out a way to address the economic aspects of this fight. And last thing I would note is I would call it going after the juice, and that's the corruption. Thoroughgoing corruption that is part and parcel of everything the Chinese do in the region. It's successful in large part because it never gets exposed. And we've got an $80 billion intelligence community budget. Devote some of that to going after this sort of under-the-table payments, the corruption done by both the Chinese, but also the people on the recipient's end. The locals who would like to have honest government would love to have that sort of ammunition to work with. I'll give one example of this. The Solomon Islands, the last motion of no confidence against Daniel Suidani, the details of the payments that were made to the officials were leaked. The account numbers, the accounts were listed, and some of these were in a very, very prominent bank that's either of Australian or New Zealand origins. Now, any reasonably competent financial intelligence operation could go after that in a second. It'd probably take them 30 minutes to figure out what the problem is. And one does wonder why the Australians, New Zealanders haven't asked this company, they asked this bank, well, tell us about this. What are you doing in terms of going after money laundering, proceeds of corruption? But there doesn't seem to be any interest in that. So there's no reason the U.S. Treasury couldn't go after it. But the point is, go after this corruption, expose it, and it is infinitely less influential. And if you don't do that, then you have left open a huge vulnerability on an important front. So those are just some ideas things that we could easily be done. All it really takes is a little bit of effort, not a whole lot of money.
Colonel, thank you. Chris Chappell, I second what was said, I think, by Cleo about the wonderful contribution your YouTube show, China Uncensored, is making to the war of ideas and to the waging of it. And I just wonder, to what extent, as you've been tracking particularly this story in the Solomons, you think the hearts and minds of the people of that country actually are still aligned with Mr. Sudani and the United States, and hostile to the government under this particular prime minister and where he's seeking to take the country. And how can we best play into, if that's so, the sentiments that we definitely want to prevail there?
I do think, by and large, the people of the Solomon Islands do align with Suidani against the Chinese Communist Party. They see the horrible influence of the Chinese Communist Party in their area, that a Chinese construction project will begin and it's entirely Chinese workers. They don't mix with the local population. One of the Solomon Islands' biggest exports is logs. You have, the Chinese coming in and just completely devastating the landscape. And on top of that, as Mr. Suidani had talked about, there's just an ideological difference. It's a very Christian country. The Chinese Communist Party is officially atheist. It uses rape as a form of torture. It's engaged in ethnic cleansing. So I think very much the people of Solomon Islands are aligned with the free world. They believe very much in freedom. The problem is the Communist Party is able to spread money around it, to buy off a few well-placed politicians, and that can have a devastating effect on a region. And this actually reminds me of something. When I was in DC with Mr. Suidani, we got to meet with a local Uyghur community. And one of the things they said, which all struck us all very, very heavily, was that when China first came to Xinjiang, where the Uyghur ethnicity lives, they did the same thing they're doing in the Solomon Islands. They promised, wealth, they promised development, all the things China can offer. And in Xinjiang, it ended with ethnic cleansing, which is happening now. And I see every reason to believe that that could happen in Solomon Islands someday. The Chinese Communist Party's influence is growing rapidly, and not much is being done to stop them. The artificial islands they built in the South China Sea is a perfect example. They began building artificial islands all throughout this region, claimed it was territory. The U.S. said, stop doing that, but they didn't. So the U.S. backed down and said, okay, just don't militarize them. And now they're all militarized. What can be done to undo that now? Not much. And as China's influence keeps growing, it will be harder and harder to push them back. And unfortunately, the first people to be abandoned will be people of the Solomon Islands, people who believe in what America is supposed to represent: freedom, liberty, democracy. We will lose that later than the people of the Pacific Islands, later than the people of Taiwan, but it will come for us too if this is a battle we don't fight.
Yeah. You know, I'm reminded as you're saying that of this ongoing saga that Joe Biden, of course, was the man as vice president who was appointed by Barack Obama to prevent the Chinese from building out those atolls and secure, you know, when that didn't happen, commitments not to militarize them. Cleo, as you know, and I'm sure you're very thrilled by, the United States is now at the cusp of having the President of the United States go to this region, though, as I think Chris mentioned, there's some question as to whether if he makes a stop in the Solomons, it will be to help this incipient, if not actual, Chinese proxy consolidate his power and betray yet again the people of that island nation. What are your thoughts about this upcoming meeting, the meetings with the Philippine President Marcos and those that he will be holding in the region? What can folks like us be looking for and more to the point, trying to do to assure that the sorts of recommendations that are being made by you and the other panelists here are the agenda, not further accommodation and submission to China?
Thank you. Very good question. So a little bit of context on the trip to Papua New Guinea. They're on their way, the leaders of the Quad countries are on their way to a Quad meeting in Australia. India saw this months ago as an opportunity to try to give the Pacific Islands an alternative that isn't China. India is the one Quad country that can really compete with China on the ground in giving affordable alternatives, access to affordable healthcare, English language education, all those sorts of things. So Prime Minister Modi had planned, from what I understand, and it's all changing very quickly at this very moment, Prime Minister Modi had planned to go to PNG for 3 days with a very large Indian business delegation to try to build up alternatives for PNG that doesn't revolve around China. Then it sounds like President Biden decided that part of what they were doing, the Indians were doing, wasn't just doing bilateral. They set up a secretariat. They put very high-level diplomat in Papua New Guinea, in Port Moresby, to facilitate this thing because they want to, and they are bringing leaders from across the Pacific Islands to Papua New Guinea to meet with Prime Minister Modi in this third India-Pacific Island leaders meeting. It now looks like President Biden's schedule is going to mean that he's effectively gate crashing that. So the Indians brought everybody together, did the groundwork, spent the time, and now that they're all in one place, it looks like the U.S. is going to show up for 3 or 4 hours it's hard to think of it as more than just a photo op, unfortunately. And Australia and New Zealand may also send their prime ministers now. So this very effective, quiet political warfare counter push by India may be inadvertently sabotaged by 2 out of its 3 Quad partners. At the same time, personally, given the relationship that the U.S. has with the compact states, with the 3 freely associated states, Palau, Micronesia, and Marshall Islands, it would be very heartening. First of all, this administration has appointed a White House level negotiator to try to get it solved. He's a very good negotiator. He's been working really hard on it. So it has done those sorts of positive things. It has opened up the embassies, even though they're not what they should be. So it hasn't been complete neglect, and a lot of it builds on what was done in the last administration, but that stuff wasn't sabotaged, which it could have been. But I think that it would be fitting if the U.S. president is going to be prioritizing a visit to Pacific Islands. And because of the geography, it might make more sense in conjunction with a visit to Japan rather than Australia, for example, to visit the compact states, to visit the 3 countries that have handed their lives to the United States to protect them, to show that those relationships with those 3 Pacific Island countries are different than the U.S.'s relationship with anywhere else. So I think that we need to look at the nuance of that. And if the question is, what can the viewers do? What can the participants do? One would be to, and we've discussed this on China Unscripted actually, is to write or call your members of Congress if you think it's correct, to talk about how important these relationships are to the U.S. and how the bilateral relationship needs to be built, not through proxies, not through multilateral organizations, but direct U.S. relationships with, U.S. Palau, U.S. Marshals, U.S. Micronesia. And in the case of places like Micronesia, where there was this push to say we want to recognize Taiwan, to support the recognition of Taiwan, to support to give Taiwan the support it needs to have the confidence to enter into those short-term disruptive, long-term stabilizing new relationships with Pacific Island countries.
Terrific suggestions. I have to say that one of the things that you've specifically suggested about the president's visit is that he may be inadvertently sabotaging this initiative Narendra Modi has launched. I don't think there's much inadvertence about the policies of the Biden administration towards this particular set of issues, or more generally towards the Chinese Communist Party. It seems to be generally most accommodating, and as I indicated earlier, submission seems to be the operative word for the United States, which cannot be heartening to all of the people and countries that we've just been talking about. I pray that this excursion of the president will not be just a photo opportunity, that it will not just be sabotaging, but that it will be a constructive exercise in U.S. engagement and expression of commitment, just as each of you has said in your respective ways, at a time and in a place where it could hardly be more important. And I want to thank each of you for taking the time to join us to make that case, as you have done so really brilliantly. Colonel Grant Newsom, United States Marine Corps retired, Chris Chappell, and your marvelous program, China Uncensored, Brad Thayer of the Center for Security Policy, and of course, Cleo Pascal of the Foundation for Defense of Democracy. Your help in illuminating what we have invested as a nation in freedom in this part of the world, and at a very high cost indeed, and why it is as urgently needed to be affirmed and reinforced at this moment in all of the ways that we've been talking about here, I think is an extraordinarily important public service, and we appreciate you doing it with us under the auspices of our Committee on the Present Danger China webinar series. Thank you. Keep up the great work, and thanks to all of you for listening. And I hope, especially if you are joining us in the video version of this in the future, that you will help us get it around to others, especially with a view to doing as Cleo has just suggested, bringing to the attention of those who represent you just how vital this is, that we take the sorts of steps we can to deter a needless, unnecessary, and almost certainly disastrous military conflict with the Chinese Communist Party. With that, I'm going to turn it back over to our friend and colleague, Didi Laugesen, with my thanks to her, and Oleg Atbashian for their terrific support for these programs, and with my thanks again to all of you. This is Frank Gaffney. Over now.
Thank you, Frank, and thank you to our panelists, and most especially thank you to our audience for being here today. A video of this webinar will post to presentdangerchina.org within a day or two of the conclusion of our program. Please share this and our other programs with your elected representatives, colleagues, and other networks. And join us again next week for another installment of our Committee on the Present Danger China webinar series on the CCP's unrestricted warfare against America and the free world, and how the USA is betrayed by CCP captured elites. Thanks for joining us today, and goodbye.
Russian man claiming to hold top-level secrets about Russian advanced bombers has just turned up at the U.S. southern border, seeking asylum. The man claims to have been an engineer at a production facility over in the city of Kazan, and he says that he possesses top-secret information about the White Swan Tu-160, which is the most advanced bomber in the Russian arsenal. U.S. border officials, they interviewed the man, and they determined that his story was in fact credible and eventually passed him off to the FBI, who are still in the process of interrogating him right now. However, analysts have pointed out that the fact that the story was even leaked to the public is an indication that perhaps the American government is encouraging other Russians who also hold top-level secrets to also escape to America. And if you thought that was interesting, well then you should click on that button below this video and check out Epic TV, one of the best no-censorship video platforms on the internet.